So our next speaker is Christos Tsagkaris. His talk, I apologize if I've said your name incorrectly. Christos, you can correct me.
No worries, no worries. It's Tsagkaris, almost correct.
I'll take almost. His talk is titled Aristotle as a Neuroscientist, the Power of Habit and the Science of the Metron.
Metron, yes, another Greek word, which I will explain shortly. First of all, thank you for the floor, and thank you to Aman for this very interesting presentation. In this presentation, I will try to take you a bit back in time, and we will talk about Aristotle as a neuroscience, his contribution in neuroscience with a focus on habit. My name is Christos, as already mentioned, and I'm a medical student at the University of Crete in the Faculty of Medicine. First of all, we need to be at the same page, and to do that, we need to know how the world of Aristotle looked like. And it was a world with many disadvantages, like he wasn't able to perform anatomical studies on humans, only on animals. Of course, he didn't have plenty of equipment for experimentation, let alone imaging or microscopic techniques. And he was fenestrated by the so-called humoral theory, a theory in which blood, biles, yellow and black bile and phlegm would dominate the human body, and their equilibrium would define health and any condition, any physical and any mental condition. However, there were some advantages in this situation, and it was that Aristotle was allowed to be at the same time at a diverse field of science. He could write and conduct research at the same time in medicine, in anatomy, and biology. And this is why he has some works called Perison Morion, which means about animals. It's a biological work. And at the same time, he could work on ethics. And this is why he has a work about ethika Nicomacheon. This means it is about virtue and about ethics in individual and civic level. And of course, he had plentiful resources of comparative anatomy because don't forget that he was the teacher of Alexander the Great. And while Alexander was conquering the world, he was sending to him any strange animal or plant he would find. So what we have in the world and in the perception of Aristotle, we have the so-called cardiocentric perception. So he believes that the brain is not the brain, but the heart. Indeed, the brain is something like a cooler, a thermoregulator. But he has something similar to the brain, which is located to the heart, and this is psych. Psych is the root of psychotherapy, psychiatry, and so on, and it's the soul. And he has a lot of works that focus on this from different aspects. What about the psyche, or the new brain, the heart in his perception? It is divided in three compartments: the vegetative, the sensitive, and the rational. The vegetative is only about sustaining ourselves, it's not significant. However, the rational and the sensitive is about thinking, becoming not only better people, but also better citizens, and this is very important. And this is why the overlap of rational and sensitive part of the soul makes the mind. And in the mind, we have the so-called ethical virtues, or what we know as ethics in Aristotle. How can somebody reach virtue? According to his definition, virtue is a settled disposition of the mind, determining the actions and emotions of a person and consisting essentially in the observance of the mean relative to us. The mean relative to us has been defined as the metron. This is the metron of the mediocrity or moderation. And it means that we need to be brave, but we need to be brave with moderation, otherwise we will be fooled. And this goes for any kind of virtue. So in Aristotle, we start from a reasonable perception of a virtue. I need to be brave because this is necessary for my city. I need to be knowledgeable because this is necessary for my self-development. And this reasonable concept leads to repetition, leading to pleasure or misery. The more virtuous we are in bravery, for example, the more courageous we are at war. Or the more virtuous we are in terms of knowledge, the more eager we are to learn. And this repeatability is called ethos and leads to ethos. Ethos is telos, and telos is the scope, the purpose of this habituation. And it is, of course, in accordance to moderation. And finally, it leads to eudaimonia. Eudaimonia means happiness. So somebody decides on a reasonable basis to be virtuous in order to be happiness at a personal and at a collective level. And what does this have to do with memory? In modern neuroscience, we have this division of declarative and non-declarative, conscious and unconscious memory. And when it comes to habit, because arete, virtue is habit, in modern neuroscience, it's something non-declarative, something unconscious, and belongs to procedural memory. And it is the striatum that has to do with this. But in Aristotle, we have a somehow different model in which we can involve the cortex because there is reasoning at the first step and conscious decisions. We can involve the cerebellum because we have repetition, so we have patterns called axes in Aristotle, and we also have the limbic system, which mediates the pleasure that we get from being virtuous. A very modern and popular science, even among management, about habit is the habit loop. In this sense, we have cues, positive, neutral, or negatives, that lead to action, to repetitive action, and this leads to the establishment of habit. However, these cues are more about sentiment and less about reasoning. And when it comes to the pathophysiology of obsession, we still have more areas of the prefrontal cortex of the limbic system being involved, but yet the reason that we have the pathophysiology in an Aristotelic point of view is that the mean is lost, and we have obsession instead of habit. What can Aristotle offer? His vision about virtue was civic virtue. It means that we cultivate arete, we cultivate virtues in the context of a city for our own sake and for the sake of the people who live at the same community. And this is something very important to Greece, where we had city-states that wanted to be self-sufficient. So everybody would have to be reasonable, and on a reasonable concept, build on his own virtues in order to build a strong city. What can we understand from this today? That we have huge countries and the cities that are not self-sufficient. We have to collaborate from science to trade to everything. Aristotle is shifting the balance from implicit to explicit memory. So we need to investigate more the overlap between declarative and non-declarative processes in the acquisition of habit. The second is that there is an emphasis on social neuroscience. We study virtue because it is a component of the ideal life in the polis, in the society. And the third one is the multidisciplinary approach. We have at the same table ethics and neuroscience. This is something that can help us a lot. Especially today that we start from mice, we have studies on people. We try to have translational science and neuroscience, but we can take it at the level of the city, at the level of the society. And this is very interesting with regard to new prospects of research, such as the brain on a chip. And how can we simulate not only the neuronal circuits, but also the sense of being part of a society in this. In the antiquity, this discussion and your questions would take place at the first image. Unfortunately, this is what remains in Athens of the first image. However, we're all here, and this agorevin bullet means who wants to speak, and I'm open to your questions. And of course, after this, I would also be happy to contact with you for more questions or collaboration or whatever. Thank you very much once more. And some references.
All right, Christos, thank you very much. That was a really great talk, especially for someone like myself who's not super hasn't been exposed much to Aristotelian philosophy. I think it was really a great primer. So we've got time for questions. So if you've got questions or comments, please post them in the chat or in the Q&A. I guess I was really interested in what you kind of ended on, which is the idea of how society is being, how this relates to society. I think it's very interesting, this idea about perhaps societal memory and societal habits. So kind of borrowing from the macroeconomics, where people say like, oh, at like an individual level, we can't really predict behavior very well, but like at the global level, we are able to predict the behavior very well. That almost seems like a cultural habit, if you will, if we are able to predict like in response to something, this is how society will respond. Do you have any thoughts on that in this in your framework?
Yes. Actually, to be honest, the trigger of this presentation and of this discussion about Aristotle started in my first years when I had neurophysiology, and we had a lot of studying about experiments on mice or functional imaging, and everything was about nuclei that communicate with each other and establish connections with chemical or electrical transmission. However, in many cases, we really forget that all this happen in a society. Aristotle would say that people cannot live on their own. People are social beings. And I thought that we neglect in the way that we conduct research the fact that everything is a matter of social interaction. And I believe that modern neuroscience should take this into account, because most of the research I'm seeing is about this nucleus connecting to the other one and a protein or a neurotrophin supporting this, which is amazing, but we need to have the bigger picture at the back of our minds.
Cool. Ben has a question. So Ben, you can feel free to unmute.
Yeah, thanks, Christos, for the great talk on some Aristotle background, which is useful for me because I'm going to mention him anyway. I had a question about the levels of soul. So you mentioned you had that slide with the nutritive and the sensitive and the reasoning, two of which I think were related to ethos and in particular like human ethics, and so eudaimonia for us and human virtues. And in my memory of Aristotle, one thing that the reasoning element was what really distinguished, in his view, in De Anima, humans from other animals. So I'm wondering how you see the virtue ethical component as tied up with the sensitive and kind of powers of locomotion and sensation vis-a-vis powers of reason. So do we get the ethical picture? Yeah, more generally about the relationship between virtue ethics for humans and then Aristotle's view of the psyche of animals.
Oh, wow. Thank you very much for this question. And it seems that you know very well the Aristotelian view of the soul. My reading and my view comes mostly from the Ethics Nicomacheon, Nicomacheon, where indeed he argues that logistikon, the reasoning part of the soul, is definitely the most important and the most superior. However, there is a distinction between virtue. We have ethical virtues which combine sensitive and reasoning, in the sense that we will have to feel something about practicing these virtues, and we will also have a moral impulse to behave this way. And this is why we have ethos and ethos. And on the other hand, we have the so-called intellectual virtue, in which only the reasoning participates. So yes, actually, ethical virtue
great answer. Thanks.
here is not the top of virtue. The top of virtue is intellectual virtue, which is moderated only by the reasoning part of the psyche.
Great. So we have to move on. You did have another question pop up in the Q&A, Christos. So if you want to address that there, that would be great. It's from Douglas. So you'll see that when you open up the tab. So thank you again for that talk. Our last talk of this session is from